Thanks a lot for the opportunity. We're going to talk about the FCC, two divisions of the FCC during World War II, the Radio Intelligence Division and the Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service. So here's my contact info. I really like uncommon radios, especially those with a good story. And to me, the story is even more important than the radio. Now, when I get a radio from somebody, I try to keep the provenance, who had it before me, even if it's just a list of hams. And I really like to do research, and I like to find a radio that people don't know much about, and needing research. And I have collect radios, and I have radios around here, but for the most part, I just collect radio pictures now. So, and I love to collaborate with anybody. So, and I also like to help people find radios that they're looking for. So, let me know if there's anything I can do for you. And I'm a member of the Antique Wireless Association, by the way. So this story here started at the Shelby, North Carolina Ham Fest in 2013. A buddy of mine from New Bern, North Carolina, among other things, brought this strange looking, it looks kind of like an audio amplifier or a piece of test gear here. And he mentioned that he had seen something on the web saying that it might have been used to track down spies. And so here's what it looked like in the front. And you can see it's got a magic eye and an antenna switch where you can turn the antenna on and off, and lots of controls, including a BFO and volume and that type of thing. And it says it's an aperiodic receiver, model K4, serial number 70. It doesn't say who made it. So here's the reference that my buddy had seen. A great set of books called The Wireless for the Warrior. Mentioned that there was one in a museum in Belgium at that time. And it looked very similar, except it was covered with naugahyde, and it was marked slightly different. And it was marked as a SSR 201, which we figured out later means special surveillance radio, model 201. And and here's a picture of it. And again, the markings are, it's basically the same radio, but it's in a naugahyde case instead of a wooden case. And the markings and the model number are slightly different. So as you can see here, mine's on the top, and the one in Europe was on the bottom. So here's what Wireless for the Warrior said. Basically said little's known of this radio, might have been used by the OSS in Europe. It says, appears to have been manufactured in a limited quantity by a small workshop having only semi-professional facilities. And it goes on, says the general appearance of the receiver is quite inconspicuous, resembling a civilian audio amplifier for public address, and blah, blah, blah. So I started doing research, and I came across this website with this document, a long PDF, called The History of the Radio Intelligence Division Before and During World War II. And it was a collection of articles and manuscripts from a guy named George Sterling, who was the chief of the Radio Intelligence Division during World War II. And also, he was the only ham to ever rise to the position of FCC commissioner. So he really knew his stuff. And George had two calls during his life, W3DF, for most of his life. But then he moved to Maine when he retired. And back then, you had to change your call. You had to have Maine's in the one call district. So he changed his call to W1AE. Well, anyway, this collection of articles, et cetera, was put together by a buddy of mine, Dan Flanagan, who now has George's original call, W3DF. So, and I put the link of this 288-page PDF in the chat window. So here's a picture of George Sterling in his retirement up in Maine. And you notice he's sending Morse with his right hand and writing with his left hand. And that was a technique used by early commercial operators. And in fact, a buddy of mine a couple of years ago said, guess what I found on eBay? And it was George Sterling's spark key, and with the provenance. And basically, it says that George used this key on the SS Kohenata merchant ship out of Hog Island. I think that's Philadelphia. And it goes on and says George Sterling, who was, and it was another guy that was in the RID down in Kingsville, Texas. But so anyway, I'm glad to have that. Here's so George was originally a ship operator. Actually, he was in World War I too, and he taught radio in Europe then too. So he really knew his stuff. By 1924, he's the assistant U.S. radio inspector for the 3rd District in the Baltimore, Maryland House, working basically for the Department of Commerce. And he's basically, this is not a normal QSL card. It's halfway down the middle. It says violations. So he's listening for bad signals, bad fist, off frequency, out of band, all those types of things. And so that's kind of cool. Now, George teamed up with a fellow named Robert Cruz, who was the technical editor of QST in the early days, and they put together a series of the radio manual. And these were very, very successful. These came out about the same time that the first ARRL handbook started coming out. But this one was actually, people liked it better. It had 4 editions and many printings of those. So it's really good. If you ever find one, grab it. It's a good read. So the FCC used to be called the Federal Regulatory Commission back in the 30s, and they mainly measured AM broadcast station frequencies, tried to keep them apart and not jamming each other, and also same with the ships, tried to keep their signals relatively clean and in band. They had one central monitoring site, which was in Grand Island, Nebraska. And early on, they didn't have any high frequency direction finding capability. But as the World War II came on the horizon, they started expanding. Here's a postcard showing Grand Island, Nebraska. And it mentions monitors the radio stations of the world. So now, if you had good radio skills back in prior to World War II and during World War II, you were in great demand, just like being an IT person now. The median income for a man in 1940 was about $1,000 a year, and you could make 2, 3, 4 times that, depending on who you went to work for. And if you had language skills and you were able to, for example, listen to a foreign broadcast and analyze that and summarize that into a report, you could make even more. So, World War II started in September of 1939, but U.S. hams were able to still make international contacts, even with Germany at that time. But in June 1940, Congress said no more international contacts for U.S. hams. So you could still operate, you could talk inside the U.S., but not to anybody in a foreign country, because they were worried about information, leaving the country. Around that same time, W1AW transmitted its first code practice, and that was in support of the war, because to help train additional radio operators. And then in September 1940, the National Defense Operations, which again was the early name for the RID, or Radio Intelligence Division, was created. And all licensed hams had to submit a photo, fingerprints, and proof of citizenship by October 15th of 1940. So they wanted to know who you were and all that. So December 7th happens. As of December 8th, all U.S. hams went off the air. They could receive, but they could no longer transmit at all. No more transmitting under or below 56 megacycle. So any frequency that conceivably could easily go out of the country was prohibited. And by March 1942, 15,000 hams had already enlisted into the military. Now, there was still a need for some local communications, and this was the precursor to what we know 2 meters and 440. At that time, it was 2.5 meters, 1.25 meters, and it was for community radio, air raids, national disaster, companies that needed low-powered VHF gear, and most of it was homebrew. And if you look at the radio manuals during World War II, you'll see kits, projects to build these war emergency radio service radios. Here's one you've probably seen at a Hamfest from time to time, and scratched your head and said, what is this thing? And this was like one of the few commercially manufactured radios for that 2.5 meters. What evolved into 2 meters now. Let's see, hold on a second. Okay, so as World War II came on, the number of FCC monitoring stations expanded significantly. By the end of the war, there was over 100 locations in the U.S., Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and all over the world, actually. Of course, Washington, D.C. was the central point. They did two things. Basically, they monitored all foreign broadcast and broke them down and figured out what they were saying, what they were bragging about, the lies, etc. And also, they continually monitored the ether, the HF bands, and they were responsible for knowing every signal that they heard, where it was coming from, what it was, etc. So there was also mobile surveillance capability, and we're going to talk about that. And these sites were typically guarded by Army troops or Marines. Here, in the case of Grand Island, Nebraska, now we have a closed gate and a gate guard as of August 1942. So I'm going to talk about the Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service first. That was also headquartered in New York City. Their function was to supply the government with up-to-the-minute news on anything outside the U.S. And they furnished different organizations, different defense agencies with different intelligence. And, they were looking for foreign propaganda and to find out what the enemy was saying, bragging about, but also, they really didn't want Americans listening to foreign broadcast because they didn't want them influenced by propaganda. So that was an interesting thing. Harold Graves was head of the FBIS, and there was a number of different translating rooms. For example, the Japanese translating room was in Denver, Colorado. So here's Harold Graves says, as of August 1941, they called it at first the Foreign Broadcast Monitoring Service, but they changed it later to Intelligence Service. Said they had satisfactory language capability in all these languages: Spanish, Portuguese, French, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they were listening to everybody's shortwave broadcast, because that really was basically the internet at that time, and doing translations and then passing that information on to a number of different groups. And of course, some folks at the FBIS, they recorded these. They had units called the broadcast recording units, and you'll see some of the information, some of the equipment that they're using, and we're going to talk about that in more detail here. And you'll see it. There's a 20-minute video at the end of this presentation, and you'll see all this stuff in action. So basically, they recorded everything a couple of different ways, and sent the recordings up to Washington every day, or to the specific translation room, depending on the language that they were recording. They recorded some of these on wax cylinders, and they started off. Silver Hill, Maryland was the first site, and then it expanded to Portland and Woodside, California, and Hawaii, and also Puerto Rico. And as the war went on, as we gained ground, so to speak, they set up foreign broadcast intercept locations across the world. And so this is basically what an FBIS receiving location looked like. Just a big wall of receivers, and pretty amazing. They also had tremendous number of wire antennas, doublets, and also rhombic antennas, should they need to transmit, for example. And so here's the classifications of information that they sent to various government agencies. For example, the A-wire items went to 25 government agencies, the Navy Department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The B-wire was propaganda summaries, and that went to Washington and New York. C-wire had to do with Latin America. D-wire, Far East. And then E-wire was kind of interesting in that they were listening for any references to American prisoners of war. So they get their name, and typically the foreign broadcast would mention the name, also the city that they were from, and so what they tried to do was to pass that information on to the through the government to the family. Here's a copy of an E-wire, and again, one of the reasons there was a huge group of folks during World War II listening on their home receivers to the BBC and all the other foreign broadcasts, and they were listening for the names of their loved ones or someone that they knew, or that kind of thing. And what people would do would, if they heard someone mentioned, they would actually write a letter to the family of so and so in a city and state, and just send that, and the post office would typically get it delivered. So the government tried to do as much of that as they could to cut down on everybody else doing it, because they didn't want to everybody to listen to the propaganda. So the Radio Intelligence Division, the other division, they were field enforcement. So they're actually the ones that were armed, and they a lot of times they went to other countries and helped those governments track down spies, as we'll see. This is a little busy, but by the end of World War II, here's a list of many of the Radio Intelligence Division sites. So if you happen to live anywhere near any of those, and you go to a hamfest, there's a possibility that some of the equipment that was used at those sites might still be floating around. So keep that in mind. And we're going to talk about the equipment here shortly. So when war started, the government, the Navy wasn't ready on the West Coast. Every signal that somebody heard, they thought it was the Japanese. They thought the West Coast was going to be invaded and all that. So everybody asked the FCC to fill in the void until the military radio units could come up to speed. So they were required to monitor all the airways and investigate all signals, and also start training military personnel and agents in radio intelligence and monitoring, and also radio direction finding techniques. So. And also, write up everything and share that information with others. Here's one of the classes that happened and Laurel, Maryland was the central point of the Radio Intelligence Division in terms of equipment development and also training. So the RID was responsible at all their sites to listen for any signal and try to identify it, document it. They might be asked to jam it. In other words, if they find out it's a particularly nasty signal for whatever reasons, they needed to have the capability to keep that signal from getting through. And you'll see that in the video as well. They also they tried to listen to both sides of the conversation and understand the lingo that a spy control station and the spy in the field would use, and to the point where if they captured the spy, they would try to continue the conversation with the control station. In other words, they would spoof or act like the spy that was captured. And certainly the British did that during World War II to a great degree as well. So, and of course, sharing the intelligence with the Army and the Navy and others, and the FBI, and also training others. And so, so basically, you have folks, multiple folks at every one of those locations, just spinning their dial, changing the band and spinning the dial, and listening for any unusual signals. Here's a typical picture of a primary monitoring station in Allegan, Michigan, and you can see one of the favorites receivers are the Hallicrafters SX-28s. There's also a teletype setup there for communications with Washington, D.C. There's a VHF receiver and a VLF receiver in some of the racks. And over to the left are some small transmitters that they would use to communicate with either other sites, if they had to talk to them by radio, other monitoring sites, or mobile vans. Now, the most famous RID location in World War II was in Chopmist Hill, Scituate, Rhode Island. And they say was the best location in the country for radio transmission and reception. And of course, they could listen. They could hear spies in the U.S. and also Europe and Africa, Caribbean, on and on. They had 183 acres, 80,000 feet of wire, and they had 2 Adcock high frequency direction finding antennas. And again, they were going to try to figure out, listen to both sides of the conversation, and also take bearings on both sides of the communication of the conversation. So, and one of the byproducts, one of the unintended consequences of the RID was they found out that they could help locate lost aircraft, and so they did that a lot, and they saved a lot of aircraft throughout the world by giving them bearings. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Department of Naval Intelligence asked the RID to set up 8 monitoring sites across Hawaii, and it turned out to be a 2-year detail, and all the important folks in the RID were involved. George Sterling, Prose Walker was head of the Hawaii sites. Charlie Ellert was the head engineer for the RID. Walt Maxwell was a very famous ham that did a lot in early satellite work later on, and lots of others. In fact, here's a picture of all the RID guys that were involved in setting up the Hawaiian receiving stations. And I only know 3 or 4 of these guys, but I'd love to be able to find out more in the future. Here's George Sterling and the head engineer, Charlie Ellert, in the Punch Bowl in Hawaii. And of course, now the Punch Bowl is a national cemetery, but then the RID set a high frequency direction finding station up there. Here's a picture of Prose Walker on the left, Charlie Ellert on the right, near the Honolulu primary monitoring station. And here's a couple of pictures from inside that field office. And again, you see a SX-25 over to the left. I also see a smaller HF receiver and a VHF receiver. And over to the far right, that light colored receiver is a VLF receiver. So here's another picture of that same setup. There's your teletype and also a pretty powerful looking transmitter. They also set up listing posts in Alaska, and RID manned these locations for a couple of years until the Army said we were ready to take over. By far, most of the spies were down in South America. Some of the countries down there were pretty friendly to the Germans, and the governments got together and said, "Hey, we need your help to clean out, to identify these spies with radios, and to basically shut them down." So that's what they did. The RID sent a whole group of guys down to South America with equipment to get them started. And also at Laurel, Maryland, they trained representatives from many countries in radio intelligence theory and techniques. They had to actually do high frequency direction finding, fox hunts basically out in the countryside with the equipment that we'll see. And, here's a typical thing. One of the messages, and in fact, the next slide talks about that. One of the messages that really concerned people was were messages that included when a ship was leaving a port, because U-boats would, could certainly use that. The Queen Mary was one of the biggest ships afloat, and but it typically traveled alone because it could go fast enough to typically outrun a U-boat. But of course, if a U-boat was in the exact right position, it could still be sunk. So there was a lot of concern down there in South America. So that's what stimulated all that. Here's a group of the military and a lot of South American folks at the training site in Laurel, Maryland. Here's a group of folks that were sent outside of the U.S., and they weren't covered by the Geneva Convention. So now the key suppliers of the RID and the FBIS, Hallicrafters, they were the largest manufacturer of radio equipment just prior to World War II, and also the Hudson and Ford automobile companies. So Hallicrafters provided the primary HF receiver, the intercept receiver, SX-28. They had an S-27 for UHF and VHF reception. There also a slightly lesser HF receiver was the SX-25 Super Defiant, and they used these in the mobile vans and also in some of the secondary sites if they had to communicate from one site to another to pass on a bearing or something like that. They also had they used the HT6 transmitters, HT9 transmitters. Hallicrafters had a crystal frequency standard that they used at all these sites to help them figure out exactly what frequency the offending signal was on. And they also had some specialized equipment. For example, a special SX-28 that was called an SSR 202, so Special Surveillance Receiver 202, and it actually had dual IF strips for sideband selection. So a lot of times folks would try to, spies would try to get real close to a shortwave broadcast station in the hopes that they could sneak their signal through. So with these receivers, they're able to strip off the carrier or strip off one of the sidebands and cut through the QRM, so to speak. So, they also had a special version of the SX-28 called the SX-28 FCC, and that was the one for mobile use, and it had 12-volt tubes, which made it easier for them to power it directly in the car. Here's a model SX-28 FCC. It says manufactured for the Federal Communications Commission. This is a picture of one that's been on eBay, so they pop up from time to time. Here's a QST article talking about the SSR 202. It was designed by James McLaughlin, who was an RID engineer, and it says the selectable sideband receiver was used to advantage to eliminate jamming while recording the enemy's propaganda. And the FBIS actually got so good using their rhombic antennas and also using these receivers, they were able to listen, for example, to Japanese AM broadcast, AM band broadcast from Hawaii, and while bombing missions were happening, so they could actually kind of hear the results or what the local announcers were saying at that point. It's pretty amazing. Here's the the very high frequency and ultra high frequency receiver, the S27. This is the S27 FCC, and it's interesting. This S meter adjustment that's right below the data tag. This was something that the FCC asked Hallicrafters to add. They needed a way to zero the meter from the front panel instead of going around the back of the receiver. And so Hallicrafters obliged and put this adjustment there. And this modification stayed in the product line, for the other folks that bought these in the future. Of course, all these sites had very specialized antennas, basically lots of big, long wire antennas, beverage antennas for receiving, and rhombic antennas for transmitting, typically. And you've already seen a little bit of some of the specialized gear, the Memorex paper disc recorders, and the dictaphone, the wax cylinder recorders called telecord wax cylinder recorders. There was also an ink recorder that could record CW at any speed. So the Germans, for example, near the end of the war, were using very short burst transmissions, which they were trying to sneak those through. And using an ink recorder, you could actually, capture all the dits and the dashes, and then someone else could put them back into text, and you'll see that in a second. They also had high frequency direction finding, and skywave means it's long distance, and then they also had some tools for close-in transmitter locating using the ground wave, which is typically like 15 miles or closer, so no skip. Here's a picture of the ink recorder, capable of recording CW at any speed. Of course, you had to transcribe that back into text. Now, here's a small picture of the long-range direction finder. This was designed and used by the FCC, and it was a manually rotated adcock antenna mounted in a wooden shelter. So they made it all out of wood so that it wouldn't affect any of the signals. And so it's basically two vertical dipoles that can be swung around, and you'll see that in the video here. And it says the indication is by aural null. So they tuned for minimum signal and not maximum in these stations. And the typical receiver used was an SX28. Here's a real early version of the high frequency adcock. They called this the Type A, and this happened to be at Grand Island, Nebraska, circa 1940. And you can see the operator there looking out the window. And then this was the Type B adcock. And typically you'd have two of these per location. And again, the idea was to, for redundancy, but also to be able to try to take a bearing on both ends of the conversation at once. I've read that one of these was AC powered and one was DC powered, so that they could figure out if anything was different. Underground wiring, of course, and each one of these either had a radio, a telephone, or a teletype link to Washington, D.C. So they basically had a net, and they would send out and say, hey, we've got a offending signal, an unknown signal on 9.1 megacycles. Everybody take a bearing and then, pass them up to Washington, D.C. And you'll see that here shortly. Here's the inside of a Type B adcock station here. And the gentleman here is taking a bearing, and you can see the SX28 in the back, and also his HT7 frequency standard as well. So it says the antenna was rotated to obtain of null in signal strength. At this point, the antenna is broadside to the direction of the arrival of the signal. So here's a picture of Powder Springs, Georgia, we think. And the setup there. Here's another picture with an operator there taking a bearing. Now, also there was another type called the Type B adcock windbreak, and again, this is Grant Island, Nebraska, which is out in the out in the plains, and they get a lot of wind out there. So certainly, it was probably pretty difficult to spin that antenna around if it was really windy. So that might be one of the reasons why they made this particular model, the windbreak model. And all this is basically a wooden shield or wall around the station. Here's another picture. The other thing that it may have been because of the wind, but it might also have been for security purposes to keep outsiders from seeing what was going on. And again, you can see the two adcox at this one location, and that was typical. So during the war, the RID was constantly testing themselves, and other people were testing them as well. For example, at one point, somebody at the Pentagon fired up a transmitter and threw an antenna out the window, started sending Morse, and just to see how long it would take. And Situate, Rhode Island, reported it within 7 minutes. The Navy took a tug, put a transmitter on it, put it out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, and did the same thing. And it says it took about 20 minutes to locate it and take a fix. But these were some pretty long range fixes, and I think they said that the era was somewhere less than 15 miles in latitude and 10 miles in longitude. So pretty good accuracy for such long distance, high frequency tests. In fact, you can see the bearings here. A couple of them are coming from California. One's coming from Portland, Oregon, up in the Great Lakes, also the Northeast, Powder Springs, Georgia. Looks like maybe Mobile, Alabama, as well. So and they all converge on a point. Of course, the more bearings you have, theoretically, the better the accuracy is going to be. So let's talk about the mobile surveillance. That was Hudson and Ford automobiles with receivers and loop direction finders. The idea was that they would locate the transmitter within, a few blocks anyway, and then they would go on foot with a handheld field strength meter that they called a snifter. And that's some British guy came up with that name. The vans also could record signals, and they had a transmitter, of course, to communicate with the local monitoring site and also a receiver, in addition to the SX-28, which was the interceptor receiver to listen in on the offending signal. Of course, heavy-duty batteries and call books were a huge help to the FCC stations during World War II, because call books back then listed all hams, domestic and international, all in one book. And so this was useful for everyone. And also, they would ride around and look for wire antennas as well. So many of the stations that they identified down in South America were ex-ham stations. Here's a picture of a 1940 Hudson direction finding car. The loop on the top of the car would actually come off. You'd still have a little stub up there, but they only put the loop up there when they were, trying to find a signal. Here's some RID guys fitting out a Ford Deluxe, 1939 Ford Deluxe direction finding car. Here's a picture of a trunk, and you can see at least one extra battery and what looks like some vibrator supplies mounted on the back wall there. And here's a fully fleshed out Hudson sedan. You've got a driver, and then you've got a nice little area in the back. I see an SX-28, an S27, a dictaphone, a recording device, a speaker, and there would be some other equipment too to be able to communicate with the local monitoring site to get their directions. And here's another picture, and you can see there was not just one loop there was multiple loops that they could pick from. And I don't have any more specific information than that, but that was also an interesting. Now the loop itself was this model, a Finch Model F115A. It's interesting. A ham friend of mine in California is actually trying to build a direction finding car. I think he has a Hudson, and he came across this loop. It also had a loop coupler that was associated with the loop that'd be mounted somewhere. Here's the snifter, the handheld. They're calling it an aperiodic receiver, which means it receives on all frequencies, but it's really a signal strength, a type of device, low sensitivity, but it'll indicate any signal from 200 kc to 60 megs. And Charlie Ellert actually designed this. So this was when they went on foot, typically within 15 miles or so of the target. And here's a picture of the last call book that was printed prior to World War II starting. And it contained both foreign and domestic amateur listings. Another tool that the RID used first was the panoramic display. And that was designed by another ham, a French ham, Dr. Marcel Wallace. And he actually started the Panoramic Radio Corporation of New York City. And they made a lot of panoramic displays for the military during World War II and afterwards. So the RID was first in using this in counter-espionage operations. Here's another picture of Dr. Marcel Wallace with his follow-up product. And this radio spectrograph SA1, it had 100 kc display bandwidth, so which was pretty good for the time, but you couldn't look at the whole HF spectrum at once, unfortunately. But you could use it for transmitter transmitter identification, also FIST analysis, and that type of thing. So it did have its place. So, but the question was how to monitor all HF frequencies at once. Fear was that they'd be missing transmissions. The pan adapter, while cool, was not the answer. So they needed other specialized equipment. So they couldn't buy it, so they designed it in-house. And that was what I found at Shelby, North Carolina. It was an aperiodic receiver. It gave indication of someone transmitting nearby, any signal from 50 kc to 60 megacycle all at once, okay? And that's why they had to quiet the ether as much as they could to cut down on the other signals that they might hear when they were at stakeout or riding around in a mobile van. The range of the receiver depended on the antenna used. You could use any length of antenna wire that you wanted. You can also, there was a switch on the front. You could also turn off the antenna when you got close, for example. But they used these at their fixed locations. They used them portable during stakeouts, and they also used them in the mobile van. And these were designed in-house, and they called them the watchdog, because these, if you were at a hotel, for example, across from the German embassy, and you were, which were not supposed to transmit to Germany. They were supposed to use commercial cable, which we also monitored, by the way. But anyway, if this thing went off, it was listening to all frequencies at once. So if it went off, then that would be the first indication. Then they would go to their other receiver and spin the dial, try to figure out what signal, what frequency the signal was at. Then they spread the word to the other locations and via their net. And basically the information here, it says the Series K aperiodic receiver was manufactured by the Kahn Manufacturing Company of Baltimore, Maryland. AC powered, it could be used for unattended monitoring. It also can just drive a recorder anytime a signal is received. And so the question was, where were these built? Well, it turns out the RID knew a fellow named Manuel Kahn, W3ZK, in Baltimore. And I think all these RID guys were friends prior to the war. And so they talked him into manufacturing the aperiodic receivers and also the Adcock direction finding antenna parts in his basement. And that's exactly what happened. So we know where it was developed. In fact, here is Manuel Kahn's Baltimore QSL card. And he actually had another location after this, but this was circa 1930. And for example, they on December 9th, somebody started transmitting from the German embassy in Washington, D.C. And on a frequency, transatlantic frequency, so to speak. And it says the first indication was one of these watchdog receivers going off. And here, they put the information out on the net. They figured out what frequency they were transmitting on, passed the word, and then got a number of bearings and pointed right back to Washington, D.C. And says down here at the bottom, the first alert was sounded by an aperiodic receiver in a mobile unit cruising DC that was immediately followed by an alert from the primary monitoring station in Portland, Oregon. So that was the first receiving site to actually report hearing that signal, that strange signal. So, since I've been watching for these, and these are very rare, a third receiver was found down in Miami, Florida. And Miami, Florida was an RID site during World War II. It came with a really nice data tag in the lid, and it kind of pulls everything together. Aperiodic receiver, Radio Intelligence Division, Federal Communications Commission, contract number, serial number, manufactured by Kahn Manufacturing Company of Baltimore, Maryland. So there it is in a nutshell. We also finally got an original manual that tells exactly how the receiver works and that type of thing. So how did the RID do during World War II? Well, they investigated over 9,000 signals. They shut down over 400 illegal stations for whatever reasons, rounded up a couple hundred spies down in South America, and saved over 600 military aircraft flying around, especially between West Coast and Hawaii. That seemed to be a real troublesome route. And of course, they saved thousands of lives along with that. Here's some of the Nazi spy radios that were captured down in South America. You can see there's some Hammerlin, there's some National HRO in one of the pictures. There's also some purpose-built. There's a pretty good spy transmitter in the left picture, right in the center. And then over to the right, you see a German spy suitcase receiver transmitter power supply. And George Sterling was actually given one of these German spy sets from one of the countries in South America in recognition of the achievements of the RIT group that went and helped them to identify and shut down spies. But no one knows where it is, so it's out there somewhere. A buddy of mine, Joel, W3ZT, a few years ago, he said, "Hey, I found something really weird on eBay, and I got it real cheap because nobody knew what it was." And it was this. It turns out to be it was a transmitter from that same suitcase, spy suitcase arrangement, and it had American markings on the front. But once you went inside, it had very European circuitry and parts and tubes and that type of thing. So anyway, Joel figured out how to power it up, and we had a few QSOs on CW. And all I can say, it had a very unique chirp on the air, so it would not have been very hard at all to quickly identify a transmitter like this if I was listening after you'd heard one or two. And the chirp might have been because of the power supply he built, but I'm not sure. So now Hallicrafters was very proud of the way they supported the RID, and they came out with a series of ads. This is a 1945 ad. This is a 1941 ad showing the one of the mobile vans there, and here's another 1945 ad showing a Type B Adcock setup there. So, and interestingly, Mr. Kahn, who built a lot of the specialized gear in his basement in Baltimore, and Charlie Ellert, who was the head RID guy. They got together after World War II and had an electronics store in Baltimore called Con Ellert. So further reading. I put the link to this 288-page PDF, free to download, in the chat window. It's a great read. There was also a QSD article, October 1944, hams in the RID. Also one for January 1945, hams in the FBIS. And again, another picture of that wall of receivers that they had at many of their locations. George Sterling himself wrote a few articles, bits and pieces of everything that's been collected, and published them in some of the Antique Wireless Association magazine reviews. But the best source of information is this dramatic video called Patrolling the Ether. And this is still copyrighted. And at least until I started doing this presentation and they ended up on YouTube, you couldn't find this video on YouTube, but you can now, and I'm going to show it to you. But you can buy it on this DVD set, and it's got some really cool little videos. If you like 1940s detective spy type of stuff, they had 50 short videos. And this video actually premiered April 10th, 1944. So during the war, and it's a 20-minute video. It turns out it was the first film broadcast simultaneously on more than one TV station. So we had TV in World War II. It was experimental, but it was coming along. And in this case, they were trying to test out how to show the same video, in different time zones at the same time. And this particular video in April 1944 was actually shown on 5 TV stations coast to coast simultaneously. Here's some of the very early, this was the FCC commissioner introducing the Patrolling the Ether video here. And here were the participating TV stations. The key one was Zenith Corporation in Chicago, Illinois. And interestingly, that TV station actually was still using a ham radio-like call, W9XZV. And then the other stations were in New York, Schenectady, Philadelphia, and then also in Los Angeles, California. So not sure if they were using telephone lines or if they had some type of if they just sent film out there or what. But so Zenith sort of headed this up. And here's a picture of the bad guys getting into a cab. And the cab is a Zenith taxi cab company. So you'll see some references to Zenith throughout this video, which are kind of cool. There were a lot of people that helped put this together, including a number of FCC guys. So we're going to show you, I'm going to show you the video now, and then we'll do an informal Q&A afterwards. So here we go.
W3 RTS calling PY2 UWV. W3 RTS calling PY2 UWV. Come in, please.
PY2 UWV, back to W3 RTS. Good evening, Philippe. You're putting in a good strong signal here. PY2 UWV up to W3
Buenas noches, Alfredo.
It is good to hear your voice again. How is my pupil?
Muito bem, senor. Tenho estudado muito. Say, have you got time to give me another lesson?
Certainly. But first I want you to meet a little friend of mine, Bonita.
Sure. Bring her in.
Say hello to Senor, Bonita. Don't be bashful.
What is that, a cat?
Sim, the cutest Persian kitten you ever saw.
Quiet, Butch. Just a minute, Alfredo. I gotta get my dog out of here.
Philip,
Yes, Mother, coming.
heavens, you'll wake up the whole neighborhood.
Gee, I'm sorry. See, there's a cat down in Brazil.
Philip, this is Mr.
Beck, Bill Beck.
Hi.
He's from the government.
FCC, Radio Intelligence Division.
FCC, Federal Communications Commission.
That's right.
Well, did you want to see me? Well, there's nothing wrong, is there?
Philip, why don't you let
Alfredo, excuse me just a minute.
Please sit down.
W3 RTS calling PY2 UWV. Hello, Alfredo. I've got a visitor. Afraid I'll have to sign off until tomorrow.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, later in the week then.
Adio. W3 RTS off and clear with PY2 UWV.
Afraid you'll have to write him a letter, Philip.
Well, what do you mean?
All amateurs are affected. There's to be no more transmitting out of the United States.
I don't get it. We're not at war with anyone.
No, we aren't. You've read of the part spies and fifth columnists have played in the fall of certain European countries. Well, they're trying to do the same thing here.
Isn't the FBI taking care of them?
Yes, they are doing a great job, but they don't specialize in radio. And today it's chiefly by radio that the enemies within a country hope to get their stolen information out of it. That's why the RID was born, the Radio Intelligence Division. It is our job to police the ether.
Hey, that's a pretty big job. You're sort of an FBI of the airwaves.
Well, you might put it like that. How old are you, Phil?
16. Almost 17.
You know, you could help the RID. Right here at home. Just keep cruising the spectrum. If you hear any strange signals, report them to us.
You mean I'd be a RID man?
Well, not exactly, but that might come later. But you would be one of the invisible army of watchers helping to patrol the ether.
Oh, boy.
Today, as a result of such foresight, our country maintains a radio detection network second to none in the world. This unseen vigilance is helping to make the home front safer than at any time since the war began. At strategic points throughout the nation, numerous monitoring stations maintain a 24-hour alert, reporting to the chief of the Radio Intelligence Division in Washington, D.C. From the secret files of RID headquarters comes a typical case of espionage, which, like many others, began when a monitoring station picked up a mysterious message. Automatic tape and disc recorders register the message. The direction finder is rotated until minimum signal strength reveals the direction of the unknown transmitter. Headquarters gets the flash. Bearings from this and other monitoring stations converge on a map. At the point of intersection or fix, the enemy station is spotted. The RID chief contacts the station nearest the fix. Instructions in voice code are transmitted.
21XY, calling 22XY.
And the cruising mobile unit receives the location of the fix.
21XY, calling 22XY.
22XY, back to 21XY.
17Q, R3, 9J8L, 9.1.
17QR3, 9J8L, 9.1.
Right.
9.1 megacycles.
9J8L. Hey, that's over on the west side of town.
Yeah, it's between Hammond and Kingsley Avenues.
Hey, do you think it's big stuff?
Maybe. Not a sound on that frequency now.
Maybe. I've been an RID man 2 weeks now. When am I going to catch a spy?
Be patient, Junior.
I've never seen a German spy. Someday I have to see one, but I can tell you anyone.
Quiet. They're sending again. Keep going. Luke's heading to the right. Slow down. Stop.
Hey, there's an apartment house over here.
Yeah. The Luke's pointing right at it. Got your sniff tube?
Oh, yeah, you bet.
Come on. It's got me puzzled. It's just not here.
Well, they're still sending. Hey, could our instruments be off?
No, we just haven't searched the right spot.
Huh.
So what's on the other side of this place? Park?
No, I think it's a cemetery.
We better go around and take a look.
Yeah. Locked. We can climb the fence.
Let's circle it first.
Well, this is the last one.
Yeah.
Hey, it's open.
Well, go ahead.
Better put that out.
Sounding stronger. It's rather late for a visit. I think I'll tag along. You cover the gate. But now go along, Junior. If I lose her, don't let her get away.
Here it is, Chief. It's in cipher, not in code. A complete transcript of everything that enemy station sent out yesterday.
Good.
How's Beck?
He never regained consciousness. One of our best men. They know about that convoy leaving Thursday.
Yes, but they don't know from what port. But they informed Berlin yesterday that they would have that knowledge today.
Well, that means, yes, here it is. Their last message. Abandoning station will transmit information tomorrow. Notify Underseas Fleet. We will attempt direct contact from 4 p.m. on. They'll probably have to use a less powerful transmitter. That subfleet must be heading west right now to get in receiving range.
It looks like the convoy will have to disband and reassemble somewhere else.
And lose weeks of precious time. To the enemy, that delay may be as valuable as a victory. No, it's up to us to keep that message from being sent.
Throughout the nation, the monitoring crews are alert, standing by for the enemy signal. Far out in the Atlantic, in the radio rooms of the German wolf pack, men are also waiting. Somewhere in the streets of the city, somewhere in the stream of traffic, the enemy is on the move. After hours of inaction, suddenly the signal comes through.
Got it. 240. They're coming in. Station 85 degrees.
Once more, the RID men make the fix.
The Yankees. They're jamming the wavelength. Looks like we can't get through that barrage they're putting up.
Stick with it. We've got to get through.
Watch out, Jerry. You don't want to break any laws.
Still on the alert, the RID men gradually locate the enemy transmitter.
They're still moving, but we've narrowed them down to 4 square miles. Area bounded by 8L, 8R, 6K.
19XY to 21XY.
21XY back to 19XY.
8L, 8R, 6K. Police stand by to cooperate.
All cars, this is it. 8L, 8R, 6K.
8L, 8R, 6K. 8L, 8R, 6K.
We've got to search all cars coming out of that area.
Is he getting through?
What's the idea?
Take a look.
We're boxed in. Let's get out of this.
Wait. We'll be safe for a while, long enough to send that message. We can get through that wing. I think we can. Collapse the antenna.
Go ahead, pull over. Okay, Sam, go ahead. Pull over to the curb. Yeah, look him over. Hold it a minute. All right, go ahead.
Go I lose her, don't let her get away.
Hey! That woman, stop her!
It's now or never.
Trying. I think I'm getting through. Jamming has stopped. Exact latitude and longitude of the American convoy.
The submarine has acknowledged. Seem mighty pleased, too.
I wonder if they'll still feel that way when they get to that position.
Well, they might enjoy coming up in a nest of our destroyers and bombers, but I doubt it.
Patrolling the ether, trapping the enemy within our borders, helping to protect America's home front. These are the men of the RID, harnessing radio to help fight the global war.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Kind of leaves you on a good high note, you know. So, any thoughts? You know, it was definitely Hollywood. The loop being inside the van, you know, is a little troublesome. If you notice, they were tuning using the loop. They were tuning for a maximum signal, not a minimum signal, like they were doing in the Adcock housings there. So anyway, it's a great video, and you know, it's a good story too. And you know, they probably made a couple of hundred of those aperiodic receivers, so keep your eyes out. It kind of looks like an audio amp, and you know, they're rare. I only know of 3. They're out there. And same thing with the interesting Hallicrafters, the FCC models, you know, and anything else you can tie back to FCC use in World War II. So there's got to be a lot of stuff out there. So,
Well, Barry, what we got in chat?
well,
Nothing right now, except everybody saying how awesome it was.
oh, good. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
I don't see any hands up. You might be out getting the popcorn.
Yeah, well, that's okay. Well, I've got some other presentations too. So maybe you guys will have me back sometime. So
I hope so. Please keep us informed. We'd love to have you back.
all right.
Thank you very, very much. Great presentation. Well done.
Yeah.
Well presented. You did a great job.
Yeah, thanks a lot. If you hear of any really weird radios that you need researched, or you know, just send me pictures. I love pictures, and and if you happen to be looking for a particular radio of some sort, let me know. I know a lot of people, and you know, I'd rather spend your money than spend my money to buy some boat anchor receiver transmitter or something. So.
Well, we'll get this out on YouTube and our other social media stuff, and we'll see what comes in. You may get a lot of help in that area.
Sure, okay. All right. Sounds good. Well, thanks again for having me, and enjoyed it. Okay.
Enjoyed you too. Okay, 73s, everyone.
73s. See ya.
Thank you all for coming.